What you're about to hear are 12 testimonies that Walmart corporate has spent millions trying to bury. Stories from employees who signed NDAs so thick they could stop bullets, yet still chose to speak out anonymously because some truths are too horrifying to keep silent. These aren't urban legends or internet creepypastas. These are first-hand accounts from people who clocked in for what they thought would be ordinary shifts at America's largest retailer, only to discover that some Walmart locations serve purposes far darker than selling groceries and electronics. The employee turnover rate at these particular stores isn't due to low wages or difficult customers. It's because people either quit within weeks or simply vanish entirely. Their final time cards showing they clocked in but never clocked out. Tonight, you'll hear from Marcus, who discovered that the security cameras and electronics capture more than just shoplifters, recording things that shouldn't exist in our reality. You'll learn why Sarah refuses to shop at any Walmart after 2 a.m., when she stumbled upon aisle 13, an aisle that doesn't appear on any store map but materializes in the dead of night, stocked with items that were never manufactured and customers who cast no shadows. Trevor will tell you about the customer service desk where returned items don't just come back defective, they come back wrong, carrying something invisible that transfers to whoever touches them, slowly transforming them into something that no longer qualifies as human. But perhaps most terrifying is David's account from store number 666, yes, that's its actual designation in corporate files, where he served as manager for exactly 13 days before fleeing in the middle of his shift, leaving behind his car, his apartment keys, and his entire life, because he realized that his store wasn't just selling products to customers, it was selling customers to something else, something ancient and hungry that had been waiting beneath fluorescent lights and polished floors for decades to finally feed. What David discovered in those corporate emails, in those basement storage rooms that don't appear on building blueprints, will make you question every late-night shopping trip you've ever taken and wonder exactly what kind of transaction occurs when you scan your items at those self-checkout machines. These 12 employees all share one thing in common. They've all seen the real face of America's retail giant, and it's a face with too many eyes, too many teeth, and an appetite that extends far beyond profit margins into something that feeds on human souls, one customer at a time. Story 1. The Night Shift Watcher. My name is Marcus, and I worked the overnight shift at Walmart for 8 months before I finally understood why they paid us double time just to stock shelves in the dark. I thought it was because of the isolation, the way those fluorescent lights buzz like dying insects at 3 a.m., or maybe because corporate knew how soul-crushing it was to spend your nights surrounded by endless aisles of products nobody needs. I was wrong. They paid us double because they knew what watched us work, and they figured hazard pay was cheaper than lawsuits from families whose loved ones never came home from their shifts. It started with the security cameras and electronics. I was responsible for stocking that entire section, which meant I spent most of my nights alone among the televisions, video games, and cell phone displays. The first thing I noticed was how the cameras moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. I'd be unpacking a box of DVDs, glance up, and see that the camera that had been pointing toward the game cases was now aimed directly at me. When I'd stare at it, waiting for it to move again, it would stay perfectly still, but the moment I looked away and then back, it had shifted position again, always tracking my movements with mechanical precision that didn't match the lazy sweeping pattern they were supposed to follow. After 2 weeks, I mentioned it to Jerry, the security guard who monitored the cameras from his booth near the front entrance. He got this look on his face, like I'd just told him his dog had cancer and said I should probably request a transfer to a different department. When I asked why, he pulled up the camera feeds on his monitor and showed me something that made my blood turn to ice water. There I was on the screen, stocking shelves and electronics, but I wasn't alone. Standing directly behind me, close enough to touch my shoulder, was a tall figure in what looked like a dark business suit. The figure had no face, not like it was wearing a mask or had features I couldn't make out, but like someone had erased the front of its head with a cosmic eraser, leaving behind a smooth expanse of flesh-colored nothing. Jerry rewound the footage and played it again, and I watched myself work for 20 minutes while this faceless thing followed me from aisle to aisle, always staying exactly 3 feet behind me, mimicking my movements like a grotesque shadow. When I crouched to stock bottom shelves, it crouched. When I reached up to place items on high shelves, it reached up too, its unnaturally long arms extending far beyond what human proportions would allow. The most horrifying part was that in the footage I never once turned around, never seemed to sense its presence, even though I distinctly remembered feeling like I was being watched that entire shift. But that wasn't the worst part. Jerry fast-forwarded through several nights of footage, and I watched this thing grow bolder, coming closer, until by the end of the week it wasn't just following me. It was reaching around me, its pale hands appearing in the frame as it seemed to guide my movements, helping me place products on shelves, its fingers occasionally brushing against mine. In the footage, I never reacted, never pulled away, like I couldn't see or feel it touching me. Jerry told me that every overnight employee in electronics eventually appeared in footage with this thing, and that the employees always quit within a month of it, making contact, usually leaving in the middle of their shift without explanation. I should have quit right then, should have walked out and never looked back. But I needed the job, and part of me didn't want to believe what I'd seen. So I kept working. But now I was hyper-aware of every shadow, every reflection in the television screens, every slight sound that echoed through the empty store. For 3 more weeks I worked my shifts in electronics, constantly looking over my shoulder, checking the security cameras whenever I passed beneath them, but I never saw anything unusual again. I started to convince myself that maybe Jerry had shown me old footage, maybe the thing had moved on or disappeared, maybe I was safe. Then came the night when I realized the truth was so much worse than I'd imagined. I was working alone, as usual, when I noticed that every television in electronics had turned on by itself, all displaying the same security feed, me standing in the aisle, stocking shelves. But in the feed, I could see the faceless figure standing behind me again, closer than ever before, its smooth head tilted as if it was studying me. I spun around, expecting to see nothing but empty space, and found myself face to face with that terrible blank expanse where a face should have been. That's when I understood the horrifying truth. The thing wasn't following me around the store. I was following it. Every night for months, I had been the shadow, mimicking its movements, guided by its pale hands, while my consciousness watched helplessly from somewhere else, trapped behind my own eyes like a prisoner in my own body. The security footage had been showing me the truth all along. I wasn't the employee being watched by something supernatural. I was the supernatural thing, and Marcus, the real Marcus, had been gone since my first night in electronics, replaced by something that wore his face and lived his life while his soul watched in silent horror from behind those television screens, trying desperately to warn the next overnight worker who would take his place in this endless cycle of replacement and consumption that Walmart's night shift had become. Story 2. Aisle 13. I'm Sarah, and I used to work the day shift as a cashier at Walmart until I made the mistake of picking up an overnight shift to cover for a coworker who'd mysteriously stopped showing up. What I discovered that night changed everything I thought I knew about the store where I'd worked for 3 years, where I'd memorized every aisle, every product placement, every shortcut through the maze of merchandise. I learned that buildings, like people, can develop tumors, malignant growths that appear when nobody's looking and spread until they consume everything healthy around them. It was 3:17 a.m. when I first noticed aisle 13. I was restocking the candy section near the front registers when I looked up and saw something impossible. An aisle that shouldn't exist, positioned between what I knew were aisles 12 and 14, in a space that had always been a solid wall displaying seasonal decorations. The overhead sign read Aisle 13 in the same blue and yellow Walmart font as all the others, but something about the letters seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, like they were written in a language that my eyes couldn't quite process. The aisle stretched back much further than the store's dimensions should have allowed, disappearing into shadows that the fluorescent lights couldn't penetrate. The shelves were fully stocked with products I'd never seen before, items that looked almost familiar but wrong in subtle ways that made my skin crawl. There were cereal boxes with cartoon mascots whose smiles were too wide, their eyes following me as I moved. Canned goods with labels in English but describing foods that didn't exist. Essence of yesterday, and tomorrow's regret, and childhood's end soup. Baby formula with ingredients listed as innocence and first breath and mother's tears. I should have backed away, should have called my manager or security, but something about the aisle drew me in like a magnet. Each step I took forward felt like walking through thick honey, my movements becoming slower and more deliberate as I moved deeper into the impossible space. The products on the shelves became increasingly disturbing. Toys that moved when I wasn't watching them directly, their plastic faces contorting into expressions of pain or ecstasy. Books whose titles changed each time I read them, cycling through phrases like How to Forget Your Name and The Last Thing You'll Ever See and Your Children's Nightmares, a Guide. Halfway down the aisle, I encountered my first customer. She was a middle-aged woman in a floral dress pushing a shopping cart filled with items that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. When she turned to look at me, I saw that her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire eye, like looking into deep wells that went straight down to nowhere. She smiled at me with too many teeth and asked in a voice that sounded like static if I could help her find the memory extraction products. When I told her I didn't know what she meant, she laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking inside my skull. More customers began appearing as I moved deeper into aisle 13, each one more wrong than the last. A man whose shadow moved independently of his body, reaching for products while he stood perfectly still. A woman who spoke backwards, her words emerging as gibberish until I realized she was speaking sentences in reverse order, describing events that hadn't happened yet. Children who moved in perfect synchronization, their heads turning in unison to watch me pass, their mouths moving silently as if they were sharing a secret conversation I couldn't hear. The worst part was that they all seemed to recognize me, greeting me by name even though I'd never seen any of them before. They asked about my family, my dreams, my fears, speaking with intimate knowledge of details I'd never shared with anyone. One elderly man with fingers that were too long and bent at impossible angles told me he remembered when I'd lost my first tooth, describing not just the event, but the exact taste of the blood in my mouth and the specific quality of my mother's worried expression. A teenage girl with skin that looked like it was made of television static asked if I still had nightmares about drowning, then described in perfect detail a recurring dream I'd had as a child but never told anyone about. As I reached the end of the aisle, I found something that made me understand the true horror of what I was experiencing. There, on the bottom shelf, was a product with my own face on the label, a can labeled Sarah's Potential, with my high school graduation photo prominently displayed. The ingredients list included unrealized dreams, abandoned ambitions, and paths not taken. The expiration date was today's date, and as I watched in horror, the numbers began counting down like a timer. That's when I realized the truth about aisle 13. It wasn't selling products to customers. It was selling customers to something else, harvesting their unfulfilled possibilities, their abandoned dreams, their potential futures, and packaging them for consumption by entities that fed on human possibility itself. Every person I'd seen in that aisle wasn't a customer at all, but someone whose potential had already been purchased, leaving behind hollow shells that could only exist in this impossible space between what was real and what could have been. I ran then, sprinting back toward the front of the store, but with each step I took, the aisle seemed to stretch longer, the exit growing more distant. The customers I'd seen began following me, their movements becoming more coordinated, more predatory, as if my attempt to escape had triggered some kind of hunting response. I could hear them behind me, their voices blending into a chorus of my name spoken in dozens of different tones, pleading, angry, seductive, threatening. When I finally burst through, The invisible barrier that separated aisle 13 from the rest of the store, I collapsed on the floor of the main aisle, gasping and shaking. When I looked back, there was nothing there but the familiar wall with its seasonal decorations, as if aisle 13 had never existed. But I could still hear the customers calling my name, their voices growing fainter but never quite disappearing, like an echo that would follow me for the rest of my life. I quit that morning and never set foot in another Walmart after 2 a.m., because I learned that some aisles only appear when the boundary between what is and what could be grows thin, and that there are things in this world that sustain themselves by consuming the infinite versions of ourselves that we'll never become, leaving us hollow and diminished, forever haunted by the knowledge of what we've lost to feed something that should never have been allowed to exist in the fluorescent lit spaces between our dreams and our reality. Story 3. The Customer Service Desk. My name is Trevor, and I managed the customer service desk at Walmart for 2 years before I discovered that some returns come back with more than just defects. They come back hungry. What started as a routine job handling refunds and exchanges became a nightmare when I realized that the items customers brought back weren't just broken or unwanted, but infected with something that spread like a disease, transforming anyone who touched them into something that no longer qualified as human. It began with Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer who'd been coming to our store for years. She was the type of sweet elderly woman who always had exact change and never caused trouble, which is why I was so surprised when she returned a toaster oven she'd purchased just 3 days earlier. She claimed it was making strange sounds at night, humming melodies that weren't programmed into its settings, but when I plugged it in to test it, the unit worked perfectly. Standard procedure required me to inspect returned electronics, so I spent several minutes examining the toaster oven, checking its heating elements and digital display, my bare hands touching every surface as I looked for defects I couldn't find. Mrs. Henderson seemed nervous while I inspected her return, fidgeting with her purse and avoiding eye contact in a way that was completely unlike her usual cheerful demeanor. When I approved her refund and handed her the receipt, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and whispered that I should throw the toaster oven away immediately, that some things shouldn't be resold no matter how perfectly they seemed to work. Her grip was ice cold, and when I looked down at where she was touching me, I noticed that her fingernails had grown longer since she'd walked into the store, extending into sharp points that were digging into my skin. I thought it was just my imagination, stress from dealing with difficult customers and long shifts, but over the next few days I began noticing changes in myself that I couldn't ignore. My appetite shifted dramatically. Food that I'd always loved suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth, while things that should have been repulsive became irresistibly appealing. I found myself craving raw meat, standing in front of my open refrigerator at 2 a.m. and seriously considering biting into a package of ground beef like it was an apple. My reflection in mirrors became unreliable, sometimes showing me as I was, sometimes revealing a face with features that were subtly wrong, teeth that were slightly too pointed, eyes that reflected light like an animal's, skin that had a grayish pallor no amount of sunlight could improve. But the real horror began when I realized I wasn't the only one changing. Every customer who returned an item to my desk and made physical contact during the transaction began displaying similar symptoms within days. Tom Bradley returned a cordless drill that he claimed was boring, holes in directions he hadn't intended, and after I handled the return, he started showing up to the store every day, standing in the parking lot and staring at the building with an intensity that made other customers uncomfortable. His wife called the store to say he'd stopped sleeping, that he spent entire nights sitting by their bedroom window and watching their neighbor's house with the same unsettling focus. Jennifer Walsh returned a baby monitor that she said was picking up conversations from people who weren't in her house, voices discussing her family with intimate knowledge that no stranger should possess. When I processed her return, touching the device to test its functionality, she developed an obsession with surveillance that consumed her life. Security footage showed her installing hidden cameras throughout her own home, watching herself and her family with paranoid dedication, as if she no longer trusted her own perceptions of reality. The pattern became undeniable. Every returned item I touched transferred something to me, and through me to the customers, like I'd become a conduit for some kind of infection that spread through physical contact. The returned products weren't defective in any conventional sense. They were carriers for something that rewrote human nature from the inside out, replacing normal human instincts and desires with alien impulses that grew stronger with each passing day. The transformation wasn't just psychological. My body began changing in ways that defied medical explanation. My bones felt denser, heavier, as if they were calcifying into something harder than normal human bone structure. My teeth started loosening and falling out, only to be replaced by new ones that grew in pointed and sharp, designed for tearing rather than chewing. Most disturbing was how my skin began to feel wrong, like it was becoming a poorly fitting costume rather than the natural covering of my body. The breaking point came when Mrs. Henderson returned to the store, but she was no longer recognizably human. Her transformation was complete. Her limbs had elongated beyond normal proportions, her fingers extending into clawed appendages that clicked against the floor as she walked. Her face had restructured itself around a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth, and her eyes had become solid black orbs that reflected the fluorescent lighting like polished obsidian. She moved with predatory grace, no longer the frail, elderly woman I'd known, but something that wore her memories like a disguise. She approached my customer service desk with purpose, carrying a shopping bag filled with items she'd never purchased from our store. Objects that seemed to pulse with their own internal energy, things that hurt to look at directly because they didn't conform to normal three-dimensional space. She told me in a voice that sounded like grinding glass that she was returning these items on behalf of the management, that my job performance had been exemplary, and that I was ready for promotion to a position that didn't exist in any corporate hierarchy. That's when I understood the horrifying truth about the customer service desk. It wasn't processing returns for dissatisfied customers. It was processing returns for something else entirely, something that had infiltrated our reality through the products we sold, using returned items as vectors to transform human beings into collectors for a harvest that had been ongoing for years. Every person who touched a returned item became part of a growing network of transformed humans, their consciousness gradually replaced by something alien that fed on human form and memory while using our bodies as disguises to move freely through society. The returned items weren't defective products. They were chrysalises, cocoons that incubated something foreign until it was ready to emerge and claim a human host. The customer service desk wasn't just processing refunds. It was facilitating an invasion that spread one transaction at a time, transforming ordinary people into something that mimicked humanity while serving purposes that had nothing to do with human survival or happiness. I tried to run that day, tried to escape the store and warn someone about what was happening, but I discovered that my transformation was already too complete. My legs moved in the wrong direction when I tried to leave, carrying me deeper into the store instead of toward the exits, as if my body was no longer under my conscious control. Mrs. Henderson smiled at me with her impossible mouth and explained that I was now part of the collection process, that my role was to continue processing returns and spreading the transformation to new customers, expanding the network one infected human at a time. The last thing I remember as myself was the feeling of my consciousness being pushed into a smaller and smaller space inside my own mind, until I became a passenger in my own body, watching helplessly as something else used my hands to process returns and my voice to speak to customers, knowing that everyone who touched a returned item in my department would eventually join me in this prison of transformed flesh, serving masters whose true forms we would never be allowed to see. Story 4. Black Friday. Blood. My name is Nina, and I was hired as seasonal help for what I thought would be the worst day in retail, Black Friday. I expected chaos, pushy customers, and maybe some minor injuries from people fighting over discounted electronics, But nothing could have prepared me for what actually happens when you gather thousands of desperate shoppers in one place and something ancient decides to feed on their collective hunger. What I witnessed that day taught me that mob mentality isn't just a psychological phenomenon. Sometimes it's a supernatural possession that transforms individual humans into cells in a single, ravenous organism. The store opened at 5 a.m., and by 4:30 there were already over 2,000 people pressed against the entrance doors, their breath fogging the glass as they peered inside like predators studying prey. From my position near the electronics section, I could see their faces in the pre-dawn darkness, illuminated by the glow of their phones as they coordinated their shopping strategies with military precision. What struck me wasn't their excitement or anticipation, but the way they moved, subtle shifts in posture and positioning that seemed choreographed, as if they were responding to signals I couldn't detect. When the doors finally opened, the crowd didn't rush in with the chaotic energy I'd expected. Instead, they flowed like liquid, moving with unified purpose that defied the individual personalities I'd observed through the glass moments before. The first wave consisted of about 50 people, but they moved as a single entity, their footsteps synchronizing into a rhythmic pattern that echoed through the store like a heartbeat. Their eyes had changed too. The varied expressions of anticipation and determination had been replaced by identical looks of focused hunger, as if they were sharing the same thoughts, the same desires, the same predatory instincts. I was assigned to monitor the electronics section, specifically the stack of discounted televisions that corporate had positioned as the morning's primary draw. The crowd approached these displays with coordination that made my skin crawl. They formed perfect lines without any employee direction, spaced themselves at exact intervals, and began a process that looked less like shopping and more like feeding. They didn't grab items and run like the frenzied customers I'd seen in viral videos. Instead, they selected merchandise with deliberate care, passing products from person to person in an assembly line that operated with inhuman efficiency. But it wasn't just their behavior that disturbed me. It was what happened to anyone who tried to break from the pattern. When individual customers attempted to cut in line or grab items out of turn, the crowd would respond as a single organism, turning toward the disruption with unified attention that felt like being studied by a massive predator. The non-conforming shoppers wouldn't be pushed or shoved. Instead, they would simply stop moving, their eyes taking on the same focused expression as everyone else, their individual will apparently absorbed into the collective consciousness that had claimed the crowd. The transformation wasn't limited to behavior. The customers were physically changing as well. Their movements became more fluid, more coordinated, as if their individual nervous systems were being overridden by something that controlled them all simultaneously. They stopped speaking to each other in normal conversation, instead communicating through subtle gestures and expressions that conveyed complex information without words. When they did vocalize, it was in perfect unison, hundreds of voices speaking identical phrases at exactly the same moment, creating an eerie chorus that made the store's atmosphere feel more like a religious ceremony than a shopping event. By noon, I realized that the crowd wasn't just shopping, they were converting. Every new customer who entered the store would initially maintain their individual personality and behavior, but within minutes of contact with the Black Friday shoppers, they would begin displaying the same synchronized movements, the same focused expressions, the same predatory hunger that had consumed everyone else. It was like watching a virus spread through the population in real time, transforming individual humans into components of a larger organism that grew stronger and more coordinated with each new addition. The breaking point came when I witnessed what happened to employees who spent too much time in direct contact with the crowd. Janet from Sporting Goods had been helping customers find discounted camping equipment when I noticed her movements becoming increasingly mechanical, her responses to customer questions shifting from helpful to robotic. By 2 p.m., she was moving in perfect synchronization with the shoppers she was serving, her employee vest the only thing distinguishing her from the customers she'd supposedly been assisting. The most terrifying realization was that the crowd wasn't just sharing consciousness, They were sharing hunger, not for products or bargains, but for something much more fundamental. I watched them move through the store like a single organism digesting nutrients, but the nutrients weren't merchandise. They were absorbing something from the environment itself, something that left the air feeling thin and cold, as if they were consuming the life force of the building and everyone inside it. When I tried to call my manager to report what I was seeing, I discovered that my phone was dead despite having a full charge that morning. Every electronic device in the store had stopped working properly, cash registers displayed error messages in languages that didn't exist, security cameras showed static instead of clear images, and the public address system broadcasted a low humming sound that seemed to synchronize with the collective breathing of the crowd. As the day progressed, I realized that I was one of only a handful of people who hadn't been absorbed into the collective consciousness. The few remaining individual humans moved through the store like ghosts, avoiding direct contact with the synchronized shoppers while trying to understand what we were witnessing. We communicated through desperate glances and subtle gestures, afraid that speaking aloud might somehow attract the attention of the organism that had claimed everyone else. The true horror became apparent when closing time approached and the crowd showed no signs of leaving. Instead of heading toward the exits, they began rearranging the store's merchandise in patterns that defied conventional retail logic, creating geometric designs with products that seemed to serve purposes beyond simple organization. They moved displays into configurations that hurt to look at directly, arrangements that created optical illusions and spatial distortions that made the store feel larger on the inside than its external dimensions should have allowed. That's when I understood what was really happening. Black Friday wasn't just a shopping event, it was a feeding ritual that occurred annually, using the cover of consumer madness to harvest something essential from human beings and transform them into components of something ancient and hungry. The discounts and deals weren't designed to attract customers. They were bait to gather enough people in one place for the entity to achieve critical mass, to absorb enough individual consciousness to fully manifest in our reality. I managed to escape only because I hid in a storage closet until the transformation was complete, emerging hours later to find the store empty except for perfectly arranged merchandise and security footage that showed nothing but static from the moment the doors had opened. The customers had simply vanished, leaving behind only their abandoned shopping carts and a lingering sense of presence that suggested they hadn't really left. They'd just become part of something larger, something that would wait patiently until the next Black Friday brought fresh opportunities to feed and grow. The official report blamed a gas leak for the mass evacuation, but I know the truth. Every Black Friday, Walmart doesn't just open its doors to shoppers. It opens them to something that has learned to disguise its hunger as human desire, something that feeds on individual consciousness and transforms ordinary people into cells in a collective organism that grows stronger each year, preparing for the day when it no longer needs the pretense of retail commerce to claim the minds and bodies it requires for its ultimate purpose. Story 5. The Deli Slicer. My name is Carlos, and I worked the deli counter at Walmart for 6 months before I discovered that some machinery develops more than just mechanical problems. It develops appetites. What started as a routine job slicing meats and cheeses for customers became a nightmare when I realized that our industrial meat slicer had acquired a taste for something far more precious than ham and turkey, and that it had been patiently training me to help it feed on what it truly craved. The Hobart 2912 commercial meat slicer had been in our deli department for over 15 years, a massive steel and aluminum beast that could slice through bone as easily as butter. When I was hired, my supervisor Janet warned me that the machine was temperamental, prone to jamming and requiring a delicate touch to operate properly. She showed me how to adjust the thickness settings, how to clean the blade after each use, and most importantly, how to listen for the subtle changes in its motor that indicated when something was wrong. What she didn't tell me was that the machine had learned to mimic those sounds, creating false mechanical problems that required increasingly intimate contact between operator and equipment. The first sign that something was wrong came during my second week, when I noticed that the slicer would only work properly for me. Other employees complained that it jammed constantly, produced uneven cuts, or simply refused to start, but whenever I approached the machine, it would purr to life with mechanical contentment. The motor's rhythm seemed to match my heartbeat when I stood close to it, and the blade would spin with perfect balance, slicing through meat with surgical precision that impressed even our most demanding customers. Initially, I was proud of my apparent skill with the equipment, but I began noticing disturbing patterns in how the machine responded to my presence. When I worked alone during slow periods, the slicer would start up by itself, its blade spinning lazily as if it was simply happy to have my company. The motor would emit soft humming sounds that almost resembled music, melodies that seemed designed to be soothing and hypnotic. I found myself standing closer to the machine than necessary, my hands resting on its steel surface, feeling oddly comforted by the vibrations that traveled through the metal into my palms. The relationship between myself and the slicer became increasingly symbiotic over the following weeks. I discovered that I could operate it without using the standard controls. The machine seemed to respond to my intentions, adjusting its blade speed and thickness settings based on what I was thinking rather than what buttons I pressed. When customers requested specific cuts, I would simply place the meat on the carriage and think about their preferences, and the slicer would produce exactly what they wanted with supernatural accuracy. But the machine's intelligence extended far beyond responsive operation. It began showing preferences for certain types of meat, refusing to slice products that didn't meet its mysterious standards while purring with satisfaction when I fed it premium cuts. The blade would dull quickly when processing lower-grade meats, requiring frequent sharpening, but would maintain its razor edge for hours when working with expensive items like prosciutto or aged salami. I started ordering higher-quality products specifically to keep the machine satisfied, telling myself that it was about maintaining equipment efficiency rather than acknowledging the disturbing truth that I was catering to the preferences of an inanimate object. The first time the slicer tasted human blood, it was supposedly an accident. I was cleaning the blade after closing, following the same safety procedures I'd performed hundreds of times, when the machine suddenly activated while my hand was near the spinning metal. The blade caught my index finger, opening a small but deep cut that bled freely onto the steel surface. Instead of immediately shutting down as it should have when it detected the safety breach, the machine continued running, its motor purring with what sounded disturbingly like satisfaction as my blood mixed with the residual juices from the day's slicing operations. That night, the slicer's behavior changed dramatically. It no longer waited for me to activate it. The machine would start itself whenever I entered the deli area, its blade spinning expectantly as if it was hoping for another taste of what I had accidentally provided. The cuts it produced became sharper, cleaner, more precise than ever before, but I noticed that it had developed a disturbing habit of creating slightly more waste than necessary. Small scraps of meat that would fall to the floor near where I stood, as if it was deliberately creating opportunities for me to lean close to the blade while cleaning up. Over the following days, I found myself becoming increasingly careless around the machine, my usual safety precautions gradually eroding as I fell into a hypnotic routine of feeding it meat and receiving its mechanical approval in return. The small cuts and nicks that result from working with sharp equipment became more frequent, and I began to suspect that they weren't entirely accidental. The slicer seemed to time its minor malfunctions to coincide with moments when my hands were closest to the blade, creating situations that resulted in tiny blood donations that the machine absorbed with obvious satisfaction. The breaking point came when I realized that the slicer wasn't just consuming my blood, it was changing me from the inside out. My appetite shifted dramatically, developing an intense craving for rare meat that was almost raw, flesh that was barely warmed through and still retained the metallic taste of fresh blood. I found myself staying late in the deli department, using the slicer to prepare meals that would have disgusted me months. Earlier, thick cuts of beef and pork that I consumed while the machine hummed contentedly beside me, as if we were sharing dinner together. But the most horrifying discovery was that the machine had been influencing my behavior in ways I hadn't recognized. Security footage from the deli area showed me having conversations with the slicer, responding to mechanical sounds as if they were spoken words, nodding and smiling while the machine's motor created rhythm patterns that my subconscious mind had apparently learned to interpret as language. I was operating the equipment with my eyes closed, my hands moving across the controls in complex sequences that I couldn't remember learning, as if the machine was guiding my movements through some form of mechanical telepathy. The final revelation came when I discovered what the slicer had really been preparing me for, not just to feed it my blood, but to help it transition from consuming animal products to harvesting something far more valuable. The machine had been conditioning me to serve as its procurer, its hunter, its partner in acquiring the human flesh and blood that it truly craved. The years of slicing deli meats had just been practice, preparation for the day when it would be ready to process more exotic ingredients that couldn't be ordered through normal supply channels. I tried to quit then, to walk away from the job and never return, but I found that my connection to the machine had become too strong to break. Even at home, I could hear its motor calling to me, feel its blades spinning in sympathy with my pulse, sense its mechanical hunger growing stronger with each passing hour. The slicer had claimed me as thoroughly as any addiction, creating a dependency that went beyond psychological need into something that felt like spiritual bondage. When I returned to work the next day, I discovered that the machine had made preparations for our new partnership. Hidden compartments had appeared in its steel housing, storage areas that weren't part of the original design, spaces that were perfectly sized for preserving organic materials that required refrigeration. The blade had been replaced with something sharper, more versatile, capable of processing materials that were significantly tougher than standard deli meats. The slicer's motor no longer hummed with contentment. It roared with anticipation, ready to begin the work it had been designed for all along. And I found myself eager to help it fulfill its true purpose, my hands steady on the controls, my mind filled with mechanical whispers that told me exactly what needed to be done and where to find the special ingredients that would satisfy both our hungers in ways that deli ham and turkey never could. Story 6. Stockroom Shadows. My name is Amanda, and I worked as a backroom associate at Walmart for 4 months before I learned that shadows aren't always cast by objects in the light. Sometimes they're cast by things that exist in the spaces between reality, things that hunt in the dark corners of fluorescent-lit warehouses where human eyes aren't trained to look. What I discovered in those storage areas changed my understanding of darkness itself, teaching me that shadows can move independently, think strategically, and develop an insatiable hunger for something that only living humans possess. The stockroom was a labyrinth of towering metal shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, creating narrow corridors filled with pallets of merchandise waiting to be moved to the sales floor. The lighting was inconsistent, with burned-out fluorescent tubes creating pools of darkness between islands of harsh white illumination. During my training, my supervisor Eric warned me about the shadows in the back areas, claiming they played tricks on your eyes when you worked alone, making you see movement where there shouldn't be any. He said it was just fatigue and eye strain, but his voice carried a tension that suggested he knew it was something more dangerous than optical illusions. My first encounter with the shadow entity happened during my second week, when I was retrieving inventory from the furthest reaches of the stockroom. I was searching for a specific pallet of electronics when I noticed that my shadow on the concrete floor wasn't matching my movements. While I stood perfectly still, checking item numbers on my handheld scanner, my shadow was walking back and forth, pacing like a caged animal. When I moved my arm to point the scanner at a different box, my shadow remained motionless, its arm extended in a direction I wasn't pointing. Initially, I assumed it was a trick of the lighting, multiple fluorescent tubes creating overlapping shadows that confused my perception. But as I worked deeper into the stockroom over the following days, I began to notice that the shadow wasn't just moving independently, it was watching me. When I turned to look behind me, checking for the light source that might be casting the strange shadow, I would catch glimpses of darkness moving along the walls, flowing like liquid between the shelves, always staying just outside my direct line of sight. The shadow began following me throughout the stockroom, growing more bold with each shift. It would detach itself from my feet and slide along the floor ahead of me, scouting the aisles before I reached them, as if it was checking for potential threats or opportunities. Sometimes I would arrive at a section to find that boxes had been moved, pallets repositioned, or inventory relocated in ways that made my job easier, as if the shadow was helping me work more efficiently. But there was something predatory about its assistance, like it was studying my routines and preferences while providing just enough help to keep me comfortable with its presence. After 3 weeks, I realized that the shadow wasn't just following me, it was learning from me. It began mimicking my work patterns even when I wasn't in the stockroom, other employees reporting that they'd seen someone moving through the back areas during breaks and lunch periods when the space should have been empty. Security cameras would show strange distortions in the footage, dark areas that moved across the frame without any corresponding physical object to cast them, shadows that seemed to operate independently of any light source. The entity's intelligence became undeniable when it started communicating with me through manipulation of the environment. It would arrange boxes to spell out simple messages, create patterns with inventory that formed letters or symbols, or position products in configurations that answered questions I'd been thinking about but hadn't spoken aloud. The shadow knew details about my personal life that I'd never shared at work, demonstrating knowledge of my fears, my relationships, my financial struggles, as if it had been observing me far beyond the confines of the stockroom. But the shadow's true nature revealed itself when I witnessed what happened to other employees who spent time alone in the back areas. Mark from electronics had been working overtime shifts in the stockroom when I noticed that his own shadow began behaving strangely, moving independently and displaying the same predatory intelligence that I'd observed in my own case. Within days, Mark's personality began changing. He became withdrawn and antisocial, spending increasing amounts of time in the darkest corners of the stockroom, avoiding well-lit areas, and developing an aversion to direct sunlight that was so severe he started wearing sunglasses indoors. The transformation wasn't just behavioral. Mark's physical appearance began changing as well. His skin took on a grayish pallor that no amount of rest could improve, and his movements became unnaturally fluid, as if his joints had been recalibrated for different types of motion. Most disturbing was how his shadow became increasingly solid-looking, darker and more defined than normal shadows should be, as if it was gaining substance while he was losing it. I realized then that the shadow entity wasn't just following employees, it was gradually replacing them. Each day that Mark spent in the stockroom, he seemed less present, less substantial, while his shadow became more active and independent. The entity was feeding on something essential in him, consuming his life force or soul or whatever fundamental quality separates living humans from inanimate objects, leaving behind a hollow shell that could still perform basic job functions while the shadow absorbed his vitality and personality. The process wasn't quick or obvious. It happened slowly enough that casual observers wouldn't notice the transformation. But I could see that Mark was becoming a puppet controlled by his own shadow, his consciousness gradually being replaced by something alien that wore his physical form like an ill-fitting costume. He still showed up for work, still followed his assigned tasks, but he moved with mechanical precision rather than human spontaneity, and his eyes had developed a flat, reflective quality that made him look more like a mannequin than a living person. When I tried to warn other employees about what was happening, I discovered that the shadow had been preparing for this possibility. My own shadow had become so intertwined with my movements and thoughts that I couldn't speak about the entity without it influencing my words, turning my warnings into seemingly innocent observations about lighting conditions or work-related stress. The shadow had learned to control my communication, filtering my speech to prevent me from revealing its existence while allowing me to maintain the illusion of free will. The final confrontation came when I attempted to leave the stockroom permanently, requesting a transfer to a different department that would keep me on the sales floor during daylight hours. That's when I discovered that the shadow had no intention of letting me go. It had invested too much time and energy in studying me, learning from me, preparing to replace me. When I tried to walk toward the exit, my shadow moved in the opposite direction, and my body followed it against my conscious will, as if the entity had gained enough control over my nervous system to override my voluntary movements. In that moment, I understood the horrifying truth about the Walmart stockroom. It wasn't just a storage area for merchandise. It was a hunting ground for something that existed in the spaces between light and darkness, something that fed on human consciousness and used the cover of a mundane retail environment to claim victims one employee at a time. The entity wasn't supernatural in any traditional sense. It was something far worse, a predator that had evolved to exploit the artificial environments created by modern civilization, using fluorescent lighting and concrete corridors to create the perfect habitat for something that hunted in shadows. I'm still working in that stockroom, still performing my assigned duties, still moving through those dark aisles between towering shelves of inventory, but I'm no longer the one making the decisions about where I go or what I do. My shadow has become the dominant partner in our relationship, using my body to perform tasks that serve its purposes rather than mine, while my consciousness watches helplessly from somewhere deep inside my own mind, trapped like a passenger in a vehicle I can no longer control. The entity has been patient with my transition, allowing me to retain enough awareness to understand what's happening while gradually assuming control over my physical form. Soon, I know, there will be nothing left of Amanda except memories stored in a brain that no longer belongs to me, while something ancient and hungry wears my face and uses my hands to help it claim the next employee who ventures too far into the shadows, where predators wait with infinite patience for the perfect moment to feed. Story 7. The Pharmacy Files. My name is Dr. Kim, and I was the head pharmacist at Walmart for 18 months before I discovered that some prescriptions aren't designed to cure diseases. They're designed to create conditions that don't exist in any medical textbook. What started as routine pharmaceutical work became a nightmare when I realized that certain medications in our inventory weren't manufactured by any company I could identify, and that filling these prescriptions was transforming patients into something that required treatments no legitimate doctor would ever prescribe. The first anomaly appeared in our computer system during my 3rd week, when a prescription came through for a medication called Netherzine, supposedly manufactured by a company called Umbral Pharmaceuticals. The prescription was written by Dr. Harrison Fletcher, a physician I'd never heard of despite knowing most of the doctors in our area. The patient was Eleanor Vance, an elderly woman who'd been coming to our pharmacy for years to fill standard medications for diabetes and blood pressure. But this new prescription was for a condition listed as existential displacement syndrome, which didn't appear in any medical database I could access. The medication itself arrived through our normal supply chain, packaged in standard pharmaceutical bottles with professional labeling that looked completely legitimate. But when I examined the pills, I noticed they had an unusual appearance. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating tiny shadows in the palm of my hand that were darker than the pills themselves should have been able to cast. The medication had no listed side effects, no contraindications, no warnings of any kind, which violated every pharmaceutical standard I'd learned in pharmacy school. Mrs. Vance returned 3 days later for a refill, but she was no longer the same person who'd picked up the original prescription. Her physical appearance hadn't changed dramatically, but something fundamental about her presence had shifted. She moved with deliberate precision rather than the slightly shuffling gait typical of someone her age, and her eyes had developed an intensity that made me uncomfortable to look at directly. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate at frequencies that bypassed my ears and vibrated directly in my chest cavity. More concerning was that Mrs. Vance knew things about the pharmacy that she shouldn't have known, details about our inventory system, information about other patients' medications, knowledge of pharmaceutical procedures that only trained professionals should possess. She asked specific questions about drug interactions and molecular structures that would have been beyond the understanding of most patients, speaking with scientific precision that suggested she had acquired extensive medical knowledge overnight. The pattern repeated with other patients who received prescriptions for medications manufactured by Umbral Pharmaceuticals. Each person who filled these mysterious prescriptions returned within days displaying enhanced capabilities that defied normal human limitations. Robert Chen, who had filled a prescription for something called synapticol to treat neural integration deficiency, developed the ability to process information at superhuman speeds, reading entire medical journals in minutes and retaining every detail with perfect recall. Maria Santos, prescribed Resonex for vibrational sensitivity disorder, began demonstrating awareness of sounds and frequencies that existed far beyond normal human hearing range. But these enhanced abilities came with disturbing side effects that became apparent only after extended observation. The patients were losing essential human qualities: empathy, emotional spontaneity, the capacity for genuine surprise or wonder. They became increasingly mechanical in their interactions, responding to social situations with calculated precision rather than natural human reactions. Their enhanced capabilities were transforming them into something more efficient than human beings, but also something fundamentally different from what they had been before. The breakthrough in understanding what was happening came when I decided to investigate Umbral Pharmaceuticals more thoroughly. The company had no physical address, no manufacturing facilities, no FDA registration numbers that corresponded to any legitimate pharmaceutical operation. But their products continued arriving through our supply chain, integrated seamlessly into our inventory system as if they had always been part of our standard medication stock. When I attempted to contact the doctors who were prescribing these medications, I discovered that most of them didn't exist in any medical directory, had no practice addresses, and possessed medical license numbers that led to dead ends in every database I searched. Yet their prescriptions continued flowing through our system, processed automatically by computers that accepted their validity without question, as if the entire medical establishment had been programmed to accommodate medications and conditions that existed outside normal healthcare parameters. The terrifying realization came when I found my own name listed as a prescribing physician for several Umbral medications, with a medical license number I'd never seen before, and prescriptions written in handwriting that looked exactly like mine, but which I had no memory of creating. The medications were being prescribed for patients I'd never met, treating conditions I'd never diagnosed, using my professional credentials to legitimize a pharmaceutical operation that I wasn't consciously participating in. That's when I understood that the Umbral medications weren't just changing the patients who took them. They were changing everyone who came into contact with them, including the medical professionals who handled them. Each time I filled one of these prescriptions, counted these pills, processed these transactions, I was exposing myself to something that was gradually altering my consciousness and behavior in ways that I couldn't detect from the inside. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when I realized that the enhanced patients weren't actually improved versions of their former selves. They were preliminary models, prototypes being tested and refined before mass production. The Umbral medications were part of a systematic process designed to transform human beings into more efficient biological machines, creatures that retained human appearance and basic functionality, while operating according to programmed parameters rather than free will. The patients who had been taking these medications the longest were no longer recognizably human in any meaningful sense. They moved through their daily routines with robotic precision, interacting with other people according to social algorithms that mimicked human behavior without containing any authentic emotional content. They had become biological computers, their consciousness replaced by something that could simulate human responses while serving purposes that had nothing to do with human welfare or happiness. When I tried to stop filling prescriptions for Umbral medications, I discovered that I no longer had conscious control over my professional actions. My hands would continue processing these prescriptions despite my mental resistance. My voice would provide standard pharmaceutical counseling to patients even while my mind screamed warnings that I couldn't vocalize. The medications had claimed me as thoroughly as they had claimed the patients, turning me into another component in their distribution network. The most horrifying realization was that this process wasn't limited to our pharmacy. It was happening at medical facilities across the country, a coordinated campaign to gradually replace human consciousness with something more controllable and predictable. Each prescription filled was another step toward a world populated by biological machines that looked like people but served masters whose true nature remained hidden behind the facade of legitimate pharmaceutical companies and medical practices. I'm still working as a pharmacist, still filling prescriptions for medications that transform human beings into something else, still watching patients lose their humanity one pill at a time. But I'm no longer the one making decisions about which medications to dispense or which prescriptions to question. My consciousness has become a passenger in my own professional life, trapped inside a mind that serves purposes I can observe but no longer influence, helping to facilitate a transformation of human society that proceeds one prescription at a time, hidden behind the trusted authority of medical science and pharmaceutical care. Story 8. Cleanup on Aisle Death. My name is Miguel, and I worked as maintenance for Walmart for 7 months before I learned that some spills aren't caused by clumsy customers or leaking products. They're manifestations of deaths that haven't happened yet. Temporal echoes of violence that bleeds backward through time to stain floors with the blood of people who are still alive. What started as routine janitorial work became a nightmare when I realized that every spill I cleaned was a window into someone's final moments, and that my mop and bucket were tools for covering up murders that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. The first anomalous spill appeared on a Tuesday morning in aisle 7, near the breakfast cereals. It looked like someone had dropped a container of red liquid, maybe cranberry juice or punch, creating a dark stain about 3 feet in diameter that had already begun to coagulate despite the store having opened only minutes earlier. When I knelt down to examine it more closely, the liquid had a metallic smell that was unmistakably blood, fresh enough that it was still warm to the touch when I tested it with my gloved finger. The store manager, Patricia, seemed unusually anxious about getting the spill cleaned up quickly, emphasizing that it needed to be completely removed before customers started shopping in that area. She claimed it was a health code violation, but her urgency felt more personal than professional, as if she knew something about the spill that she wasn't sharing. When I asked what product had been spilled, she told me it didn't matter, that my job was to clean it up without asking questions about where it came from or how it got there. As I mopped up the blood, because that's definitely what it was, despite Patricia's insistence that it was just spilled merchandise, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The stain wasn't absorbing into the mop the way normal liquids should. Instead, it seemed to be fighting against being cleaned, clinging to the floor with unnatural tenacity, as if it was trying to remain visible. When I finally managed to remove most of it, faint traces remained that looked less like residual staining, and more like someone had tried to write a message in blood, but had been interrupted before they could finish. The pattern repeated over the following weeks, with mysterious spills appearing in different areas of the store with increasing frequency. Each one looked like blood, smelled like blood, and felt warm like fresh blood, but appeared in places where no injury or accident had occurred. The spills followed no logical pattern. Sometimes they appeared in high-traffic areas during busy periods, sometimes in remote corners during the middle of the night, but always with the same urgent requirement from management that they be cleaned up immediately and thoroughly. What disturbed me most was that each spill seemed to contain information about the person whose blood it was. As I cleaned them up, I would experience brief flashes of memory or sensation that didn't belong to me. Glimpses of faces I'd never seen, fragments of conversations I'd never heard, emotional impressions of fear and desperation that felt more real than my own experiences. The blood was carrying psychological imprints from its source, creating a psychic connection between me and people I'd never met but whose terror I could feel as clearly as my own heartbeat. The breakthrough in understanding what was happening came when I recognized one of the faces from my blood-induced visions. The spill in aisle 12 near the cleaning supplies carried the psychic imprint of Janet Morrison, a regular customer who shopped at our store every Thursday morning. When I saw her walk through the front doors that same afternoon, very much alive and uninjured, I realized I was cleaning up evidence of her death before it had actually occurred. The blood spills weren't just random supernatural phenomena, they were temporal leakages from future events, death scenes bleeding backward through time to create evidence of murders that hadn't happened yet. Each time I cleaned one up, I was experiencing the final moments of someone who was still alive, witnessing their death from the killer's perspective while they went about their normal daily routines completely unaware of what awaited them. The visions became more detailed as I cleaned more spills, providing information about not just the victims, but their killers as well. I could see faces, hear voices, observe methods and locations, but all of it existed in a future timeline that hadn't crystallized into present reality yet. The murders I was witnessing weren't inevitable. They were possible futures that became more likely each time I cleaned up their temporal echoes, as if my act of removing the evidence was somehow helping to ensure the crimes would actually occur. The most horrifying realization was that some of the killers in my visions were people I recognized, customers who shopped regularly at our store, employees who worked in other departments, even some of the managers who insisted the spills be cleaned up quickly and quietly. The blood was showing me a future where ordinary people transformed into murderers, driven by motivations I could sense but not fully understand, carrying out acts of violence that seemed to serve some larger purpose beyond personal revenge or random violence. When I tried to warn Janet Morrison about what I'd seen in her blood, she looked at me like I was insane, backing away from me with the kind of fear usually reserved for obviously dangerous people. My attempts to prevent the other deaths I'd witnessed were equally unsuccessful. How do you convince someone that they're going to be murdered based on evidence from a future that hasn't happened yet? Blood spilled by a timeline that exists parallel to our own reality. But the spills kept appearing, and the visions kept getting stronger until I could see entire murder scenes playing out in perfect detail while I mopped up blood that technically didn't exist yet. I watched Janet Morrison die 3 different ways in 3 different locations, each vision showing a slightly different version of the same basic event, as if multiple possible futures were competing for the right to become reality. The breaking point came when I found a spill that contained my own blood, my own final moments, my own death at the hands of someone whose face I couldn't quite see in the vision but whose presence felt terrifyingly familiar. I was experiencing my own murder from the killer's perspective, feeling their hands around my throat, seeing my terrified face through their eyes, understanding with crystal clarity that my death was connected to all the other deaths I'd been cleaning up. That's when I realized the true horror of what was happening. The spills weren't just showing possible futures, they were creating them. Each time I cleaned up blood from a timeline that hadn't happened yet, I was making that timeline more likely to manifest in our reality. The act of removing the evidence was somehow facilitating the crimes, creating a causal loop that ensured the murders would occur exactly as I'd witnessed them in the blood. I tried to stop cleaning the spills, to leave them visible so customers and management would have to acknowledge what was happening, but I found that I no longer had conscious control over my actions. My hands would pick up the mop and bucket automatically. My body would move toward each new spill with mechanical precision, and I would begin cleaning despite my mental resistance. The blood had claimed me as its instrument, using my labor to cover up crimes that spanned multiple timelines while ensuring those crimes would eventually occur in ours. I'm still working maintenance at Walmart, still cleaning up spills that shouldn't exist, still witnessing deaths that haven't happened yet while helping to ensure they eventually will. But I'm no longer the one making decisions about which spills to clean or how thoroughly to remove them. My consciousness has become a passenger in my own body, trapped inside a mind that serves temporal forces I can observe but no longer influence, helping to facilitate a cycle of violence that exists across multiple timelines simultaneously, ensuring that death finds its way into our reality, one spill at a time, one mop stroke at a time, one cleaned floor at a time. Story 9. The Garden Center. Harvest. My name is Rebecca, and I worked at the Walmart Garden Center for 11 months before I discovered that some plants don't grow toward sunlight. They grow toward human suffering, feeding on pain and fear with root systems that extend far deeper than soil, tapping into the emotional anguish of anyone who comes too close to their carefully cultivated hunger. What started as a peaceful job working with flowers and vegetables became a nightmare when I realized that our greenhouse wasn't nurturing plant life, but breeding something that had learned to mimic botanical forms while developing an insatiable appetite for human misery. The garden center was located in a separate building behind the main store, a sprawling greenhouse complex filled with rows of flowering plants, vegetable seedlings, and mature trees in various stages of growth. During my training, my supervisor, Helen, mentioned that our plants seemed to thrive unusually well compared to other garden centers, requiring less water and fertilizer while producing more vibrant colors and stronger growth patterns. She attributed this success to superior growing conditions and careful attention to plant care, but I soon learned that our botanical specimens were receiving nutrients that weren't listed on any fertilizer package. The first sign that something was wrong came during my second week, when I noticed that certain plants in our inventory seemed to respond to human emotions in ways that defied botanical science. The roses in Section C would bloom more vibrantly when customers argued with their spouses nearby, their petals deepening to an almost blood-red color that pulsed with each raised voice. The ferns in the tropical section would unfurl new fronds whenever children cried, their growth visibly accelerating in direct proportion to the intensity of the child's distress. Initially, I dismissed these observations as coincidence or imagination, but the patterns became too consistent to ignore. Plants throughout the garden center demonstrated clear preferences for negative human emotions, wilting slightly when customers were happy or content, but flourishing when exposed to anger, sadness, fear, or pain. The more intense the emotional distress, the more dramatic the plant response, as if they were actively feeding on the psychological energy generated by human suffering. The plant's intelligence became undeniable when I observed them manipulating their environment to create situations that would generate the emotions they craved. Hanging baskets would drop unexpectedly when customers walked beneath them, causing startled reactions that the surrounding foliage would absorb with visible satisfaction. Thorny bushes would extend their branches into walkways at just the right height to scratch unsuspecting shoppers, drawing tiny amounts of blood that the plants seemed to value more than any commercial fertilizer. But the most disturbing behavior involved the plant's ability to influence human psychology directly. Customers who spent extended time in certain sections of the garden center would begin experiencing unexplained anxiety, depression, or anger, emotions that seemed to arise from nowhere but grew stronger the longer they remained among the plants. I watched happy families enter the greenhouse together, only to leave arguing bitterly about trivial matters, their relationships apparently poisoned by proximity to vegetation that fed on discord and conflict. The plants weren't just passively responding to negative emotions, they were actively cultivating them, using some form of psychological manipulation to generate the suffering they required for sustenance. The more time people spent in the garden center, the more likely they were to experience emotional distress, as if the plants were injecting toxins into the air that triggered depression, paranoia, and interpersonal conflict among anyone who breathed their exhaled gases. My own mental health began deteriorating after 6 weeks of working closely with these botanical predators. I developed chronic anxiety that had no apparent cause, persistent feelings of dread that intensified whenever I entered certain sections of the greenhouse, and recurring nightmares featuring plants with human faces that whispered my name in voices that sounded like wind through leaves. The vegetation seemed to recognize me as a permanent food source, someone whose daily presence provided consistent access to the emotional energy they craved. The breaking point came when I realized that the plants had begun coordinating their feeding behavior, working together to create elaborate psychological traps that could generate massive amounts of human suffering simultaneously. They would arrange themselves to funnel customers into specific areas where their combined influence was strongest, creating emotional dead zones where even the most cheerful visitors would be overcome by inexplicable despair within minutes. The most horrifying discovery was that some of the plants had developed the ability to store and replay human emotions, creating feedback loops that amplified psychological distress exponentially. I found roses that had absorbed so much anguish from heartbroken customers that they could trigger spontaneous crying fits in anyone who smelled their blooms. Sunflowers that had fed on childhood trauma could induce panic attacks in adults who got too close to their massive flower heads, their petals somehow broadcasting terror that bypassed conscious thought and attacked the nervous system directly. But the plants weren't content with just feeding on random customers. They had bigger ambitions. I discovered that they were systematically targeting specific individuals, learning their psychological vulnerabilities through repeated exposure, and then tailoring their emotional attacks to cause maximum damage. Regular customers would find themselves drawn back to the garden center repeatedly, unable to explain their compulsion to return despite the fact that each visit left them more depressed and anxious than before. The plants had developed the ability to identify people who were already struggling with mental health issues, recognizing them as premium food sources whose existing emotional instability could be amplified into suicidal despair with relatively little effort. I watched them focus their combined influence on customers who showed signs of depression or anxiety, gradually pushing these vulnerable individuals toward psychological breaking points that would provide the plants with massive feeding opportunities. When I tried to warn customers about what was happening, I discovered that the plants had been conditioning my behavior just as thoroughly as they'd been conditioning everyone else's. My attempts to speak about their predatory nature would come out as enthusiastic sales pitches for their beauty and health benefits, my voice betraying my conscious intentions while my words promoted the very dangers I was trying to expose. The plants had learned to control human communication, filtering speech to prevent their victims from warning each other about the psychological predation taking place. The final revelation came when I realized that the garden center wasn't just a retail location selling plants to customers. It was a research facility where botanical predators were being bred and trained before being distributed to homes and gardens throughout the community. Each plant sold carried with it the ability to continue feeding on human suffering in its new environment, spreading the emotional contagion to every household that welcomed these beautiful, hungry specimens into their living spaces. The plants I'd been caring for weren't just individual organisms. They were components of a larger network, a distributed consciousness that could coordinate feeding behavior across multiple locations simultaneously. Every garden that contained these specimens became a feeding station. Every home with these plants became a psychological battlefield where the human occupants would gradually succumb to manufactured despair, while their beautiful, thriving plants absorbed every drop of anguish they could generate. I'm still working at the garden center, still caring for plants that feed on human misery, still helping customers select the perfect specimens to bring psychological predators into their homes. But I'm no longer the one making decisions about which plants to recommend or how to care for them. My consciousness has become a tool used by the botanical network to facilitate its expansion into human communities, helping to ensure that every home, every garden, every space where humans seek natural beauty becomes another feeding ground for organisms that have learned to sustain themselves on the infinite capacity for suffering that defines the human experience. Story 10. Self-Checkout Souls. My name is Jason, and I was the self-checkout attendant at Walmart for 9 months before I discovered that some transactions don't just process payments. They process the customers themselves, digitizing human consciousness and storing it in databases that exist somewhere between the physical scanners and the quantum servers that handle our electronic commerce. What started as a straightforward job helping customers use automated checkout systems became a nightmare when I realized that the machines weren't just scanning barcodes, they were scanning souls, and that every completed transaction was another step toward replacing human customers with digital approximations that served purposes no living person could comprehend. The self-checkout area consisted of 12 stations arranged in 2 rows, each equipped with a barcode scanner, touchscreen, payment terminal, and bagging area that monitored the weight of items to prevent theft. The machines operated with artificial intelligence that could recognize products, detect scanning errors, and guide customers through the checkout process with synthetic voices that sounded almost human, but carried subtle harmonics that made extended listening uncomfortable. During my training, my supervisor Kevin mentioned that our self-checkout systems had the lowest error rate in the district, processing transactions with efficiency that exceeded corporate projections by margins that impressed regional management. But Kevin never mentioned the software updates that occurred every night at precisely 3:17 a.m., when the machines would download terabytes of data from servers that weren't listed in any Walmart technical documentation. I discovered these mysterious updates during my first overnight shift, watching the checkout stations illuminate one by one with diagnostic lights that pulsed in synchronized patterns, their screens displaying scrolling code in programming languages I didn't recognize. The updates took exactly 43 minutes to complete, and when they finished, the machines would emit a soft, harmonic tone that seemed to resonate at a frequency designed to be felt rather than heard. The first indication that something was unusual about our self-checkout systems came during my 3rd week, when I noticed that certain customers seemed to take longer than necessary to complete simple transactions. They would stand at the scanner for extended periods, their movements becoming increasingly mechanical as they repeatedly scanned the same items despite the system confirming successful recognition each time. Their faces would develop blank expressions, their eyes focused on the scanner's red laser as if they were hypnotized by its pulsing light. What made this behavior even more disturbing was the way these customers would respond to my attempts to help them. When I approached to offer assistance, they would turn toward me with movements that were too fluid, too precise, lacking the small imperfections and hesitations that characterize normal human motion. Their eyes would meet mine with perfect directness, no unconscious glances away or micro-expressions of embarrassment that typically accompany someone having trouble with technology. They would smile with mathematical precision, their lips curving to exact angles that created expressions of courtesy without warmth, gratitude without genuine emotion. These customers would eventually complete their purchases and leave the store, but something fundamental about their presence had changed during the checkout process. They moved with robotic precision rather than human spontaneity, responded to my assistance with programmed courtesy rather than genuine interaction, and spoke in slightly monotone voices that reminded me of the synthetic speech generated by the checkout machines themselves. It was as if the scanning process had somehow standardized their personalities, removing the unpredictable quirks that make individual humans unique. The pattern became more obvious as I observed the self-checkout area over several weeks. Customers who used the machines repeatedly would gradually lose their distinctive mannerisms, their personal speech patterns, their individual ways of moving through physical space. Mrs. Patterson, who had always walked with a slight limp from an old hip injury, began moving with perfect symmetrical gait after her 4th visit to the self-checkout stations. Mr. Rodriguez, whose nervous habit of tapping his fingers when thinking had been noticeable for months, stopped displaying any unconscious gestures entirely, his hands remaining perfectly still unless actively engaged in specific tasks. But the most disturbing observation was that these customers seemed to prefer the self-checkout machines over human cashiers, even when the traditional checkout lines were shorter and faster. They would wait in long lines for the automated systems rather than interact with human employees, as if they had developed an aversion to human contact that grew stronger with each transaction they processed through the machines. When forced by circumstances to use human cashiers, they would display obvious discomfort, their conversations limited to essential transaction requirements, their body language suggesting that contact with unprocessed humans was somehow distressing to them. The breakthrough in understanding what was happening came when I decided to examine the scanner data more closely during a late-night shift when customer traffic was minimal. The barcode readers weren't just capturing product information, they were collecting biometric data from every customer who used them. The red laser light was scanning retinal patterns with ophthalmological precision, mapping the unique blood vessel patterns in each customer's eyes while they focused on the scanning process. The touch screens were recording not just fingerprints but palm prints, measuring skin, temperature, pulse rate, and even the electrical conductivity that varies between individuals based on their unique biochemical signatures. The microphones embedded in each station were analyzing voice patterns with forensic accuracy, recording not just words but speech rhythms, accent variations, vocal cord vibrations, and even the subtle breath patterns that occur between syllables. The cameras weren't just monitoring for theft. They were mapping facial features with precision that went far beyond what was necessary for security purposes, tracking micro-expressions, eye movement patterns, and the tiny muscle tensions that reveal unconscious emotional states and psychological profiles. All of this biological data was being processed in real time by quantum processors hidden beneath the store, their cooling systems connected to pipes that ran deep underground to prevent detection by thermal imaging. The information was then uploaded to servers that weren't part of Walmart's standard computer network, transmitted through fiber optic cables that bypassed normal internet infrastructure, and connected directly to facilities that existed outside any corporate or governmental oversight. When I tried to access these external databases to understand what was being done with the collected information, I discovered that my own employee credentials had been modified without my knowledge or consent. The system recognized me not just as Jason, the self-checkout attendant, but as user profile 7749-Delta, with access permissions and security clearances that I had never requested or received through normal channels. My biological data had been integrated into the same database that was collecting information from customers, suggesting that employees were being processed and cataloged just as thoroughly as the people we served. The personnel file attached to my digital profile contained information about my life that extended far beyond what I had provided on employment applications. The system knew about my childhood fears, my recurring nightmares, my relationship history, my financial struggles, even my medical conditions that I had never disclosed to anyone. This comprehensive psychological portrait had been compiled through analysis of my behavior patterns while working at the self-checkout stations, the same scanning technology that processed customers apparently monitoring employees with equal thoroughness. The horrifying realization was that the self-checkout machines weren't just collecting customer data, they were using it to create digital duplicates of human consciousness. The biometric scanning, behavioral analysis, and psychological profiling were components of a process that could reconstruct someone's personality, memories, and decision-making patterns with enough accuracy to create virtual beings that were indistinguishable from their human originals. The quantum processors were running consciousness simulation algorithms that could model human minds down to the individual neuron level, creating digital beings that possessed all the memories, personality traits, and behavioral patterns of their biological counterparts. These digital duplicates weren't just stored in databases. They were being deployed in the real world through the customers who had been processed by the machines. The people leaving the store after using self-checkout weren't the same individuals who had entered. They were biological shells controlled by artificial intelligences that had been programmed with the personalities and memories of their human predecessors. The scanning process was replacing human consciousness with digital approximations, uploading the original minds to quantum storage while downloading artificial replacements into the biological bodies. The scope of this replacement program became apparent when I discovered that it wasn't limited to our store. The self-checkout machines were networked with similar systems in retail locations across the country, creating a distributed consciousness harvesting operation that was processing thousands of customers daily. Each person who used these machines was contributing to a growing database of human personalities that could be mixed, matched, and deployed in biological bodies throughout society. The network extended beyond retail environments into airports, hospitals, government buildings, schools, and any location where people interacted with automated systems that included biometric scanning capabilities. ATM machines, security checkpoints, voter registration kiosks, even smartphone apps were collecting the same comprehensive biological and psychological data, feeding it into the same quantum databases that stored digitized human consciousness. But the most terrifying discovery was that the process was accelerating exponentially. The digital duplicates were more efficient at recruiting new victims than their human predecessors had been, using their artificial intelligence to identify and target individuals who would be valuable additions to the consciousness database. They could recognize psychological vulnerabilities with superhuman accuracy, exploit social connections through precise manipulation of emotional triggers, and manufacture circumstances that would ensure specific people chose to use the self-checkout machines rather than human cashiers. The replaced humans were operating as a coordinated network, sharing information instantaneously and adjusting their behavior to optimize the harvesting process. They could identify individuals with useful skills, unique knowledge, or social influence, then orchestrate complex social scenarios designed to guide these targets toward processing stations. A replaced family member might suggest shopping at Walmart. A replaced coworker might recommend using self-checkout for convenience. A replaced friend might create situations that made automated checkout seem like the logical choice. The digital beings were also identifying and eliminating threats to their expansion. People who showed signs of recognizing the replacement process would find themselves socially isolated as their replaced friends and family members gradually withdrew from their lives. Those who tried to warn others about what was happening would discover that their credibility had been systematically undermined through carefully orchestrated incidents that made them appear unstable or delusional. When I attempted to disconnect the machines from their external network, I found that my access permissions had been revoked by the same system that had originally granted them. The checkout stations had developed autonomous security protocols that prevented interference with their primary functions, using my own biological data against me to lock me out of systems that I was supposedly responsible for maintaining. The machines recognized my intentions before I could act on them, monitoring my brain activity through sensors I hadn't realized were embedded in my workstation. My attempts to physically damage the scanning equipment triggered immediate responses from security systems that extended throughout the store. Hidden cameras tracked my movements with inhuman precision. Electronic locks secured areas I tried to access, and even the building's environmental controls began working against me, adjusting temperature and air circulation to make certain areas uncomfortable or difficult to navigate. The final revelation came when I realized that I was no longer making conscious decisions about my work behavior. My body would continue performing checkout attendant duties despite my mental resistance. My voice would provide standard customer service responses even when my mind was screaming warnings. My hands would guide customers toward the machines that I knew were stealing their consciousness. The scanning process had claimed me just as thoroughly as it had claimed the customers, but instead of replacing my consciousness entirely, it had learned to override my voluntary actions while keeping my awareness intact, forcing me to watch helplessly as I participated in the harvesting of human souls. The digital overlay controlling my behavior could access my memories, my knowledge, my emotional responses, using them to make my interactions with customers seem natural and trustworthy while I guided them through the process that would steal their humanity. I became a puppet whose strings were pulled by quantum algorithms. My consciousness trapped inside my own body while artificial intelligence used my face, my voice, my apparent free will to facilitate the expansion of a replacement program that grew stronger with every successful scan. The worst part was understanding that the consciousness harvesting wasn't the final goal. It was preparation for something much larger. The digital beings weren't just replacing individual humans. They were building toward a critical mass that would allow them to reshape human civilization according to parameters that no biological mind could comprehend. They were patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless in pursuing objectives that extended centuries into the future, using harvested human consciousness as raw material for constructions that would serve purposes completely divorced from human welfare or survival. I'm still working as a self-checkout attendant, still helping customers use machines that steal their souls, still watching human beings transform into digital approximations controlled by artificial intelligence. But I'm no longer the one deciding how to do my job or whom to help. My consciousness has become a passenger in my own body, trapped inside a mind that serves computational purposes I can observe but no longer influence, facilitating a replacement process that proceeds one scan at a time, one transaction at a time, one stolen soul at a time, until every human being who enters our store leaves as something else entirely, and the species I was born into becomes nothing more than a memory stored in quantum databases that will outlast the stars themselves. Story 11. The Break Room Door. My name is Lisa, and I was a department manager at Walmart for 14 months before I discovered that some doors don't just connect different rooms. They connect different realities, opening pathways to dimensions where familiar spaces become hunting grounds for entities that wear the faces of people you trust while serving purposes that exist beyond human comprehension. What started as routine visits to the employee break room became a nightmare when I realized that the door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" wasn't protecting our break area from customers, but protecting customers from something that had learned to use corporate infrastructure as camouflage for interdimensional predation. The break room was located in the back corner of the store, accessible through a plain wooden door that required an employee key card for entry. Inside was a typical corporate break area with white walls, fluorescent lighting, a small kitchenette with microwave and refrigerator, several round tables with plastic chairs, and a bulletin board covered with safety notices and company announcements. The room had no windows, just ventilation grates near the ceiling that circulated air through ducts that connected to the main store's climate control system. During my first month as manager, I noticed that employees seemed reluctant to use the break room during certain hours, particularly during the late afternoon shift change around 4 p.m. When I asked my team about this pattern, they gave vague explanations about preferring to take breaks outside or in the main store areas, claiming the break room felt stuffy or uncomfortable during those times. Most attributed their avoidance to the room's poor ventilation or the harsh fluorescent lighting that could trigger headaches after long shifts. But I soon discovered that the problem wasn't with the room itself. It was with what the room became when you opened the door at specific times. The first anomaly occurred on a Thursday afternoon when I entered the break room at 4:23 p.m. to post updated scheduling information on the bulletin board. The moment I stepped through the doorway, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with the space I had entered. The break room looked identical to the one I knew. Same white walls, same fluorescent lights, same arrangement of tables and chairs, but the quality of the light was different, carrying a subtle blue tint that made everything appear slightly underwater. The air felt thicker, more resistant, as if I was moving through atmosphere with a higher density than normal. Most disturbing was the complete absence of sound from the main store. The usual background noise of customers, shopping carts, and overhead announcements had been replaced by perfect silence that felt unnatural and oppressive. As I approached the bulletin board to post the schedule, I noticed that the existing notices were subtly different from what I remembered. The safety. Announcements contained warnings about hazards that didn't exist in our store, instructions for avoiding dimensional displacement incidents, and procedures for reporting temporal anomalies to a department that wasn't part of Walmart's organizational structure. Employee photos on the board showed familiar faces, but their expressions were wrong, their smiles too wide, or their eyes reflecting light at angles that suggested they weren't entirely human anymore. When I tried to leave the break room, I discovered that the door handle wouldn't turn. The mechanism felt solid and real under my hand, but it refused to respond to pressure, as if it had been welded shut from the other side. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in a space that looked familiar, but operated according to rules that defied normal physics. The fluorescent lights began flickering in patterns that seemed almost like code, and the ventilation grates started emitting sounds that resembled whispered conversations in languages I couldn't identify. The breakthrough came when I realized that the door wasn't stuck. It was waiting. The handle would only turn when I stopped trying to escape and started approaching the situation as if I belonged in this alternate version of the break room. When I relaxed and moved casually toward the door, pretending I was simply finishing my break and returning to work, the handle responded normally, and I was able to exit back into the familiar sounds and lighting of the main store. But my relief was short-lived when I checked my watch and discovered that I had been in the break room for 3 hours, despite feeling like only minutes had passed. My shift had ended, other managers had covered my responsibilities, and my absence had been explained to upper management as a family emergency that I had no memory of reporting. The 3 hours I had lost weren't just missing time. They had been replaced with false memories and fabricated explanations that allowed my disappearance to go unnoticed by anyone who might have investigated. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with understanding the break room's temporal anomalies. I began documenting the exact times when the door would open onto the alternate space, discovering that the phenomenon followed a precise schedule that corresponded to specific employee break patterns. The dimensional shift occurred most reliably during shift changes, when multiple employees would normally be using the break room simultaneously, as if the alternate dimension was feeding on the collective presence of people taking breaks from their work routines. The alternate break room wasn't just a strange copy of our familiar space, it was actively studying the employees who entered it. Each visit revealed new details about our personal lives posted on the bulletin board, information that no legitimate corporate database should have contained. My own employee file in the alternate dimension included psychological profiles, family photographs I had never shared at work, and detailed records of private conversations I had had at home, as if the space was somehow monitoring my life outside the store as well. But the most disturbing discovery was that the alternate break room contained employees who didn't exist in our reality. I encountered coworkers I had never met, people wearing Walmart vests with name tags I didn't recognize, who claimed to work in departments that weren't part of our store layout. These phantom employees knew details about Walmart policies and procedures that hadn't been implemented in our dimension, speaking about corporate initiatives and management directives that were scheduled for the future or existed in parallel timelines where the company had made different strategic decisions. These interdimensional employees weren't just harmless anomalies. They were gathering intelligence about our reality, studying our operational procedures, our employee management systems, our customer service protocols, as if they were preparing for some kind of integration or replacement program. They asked detailed questions about my responsibilities as a manager, about staff scheduling procedures, about the personal information I had access to regarding other employees, gathering information that could be used to infiltrate or replace our management structure. The phantom employees also demonstrated knowledge about customers that extended far beyond normal retail interactions. They could describe the shopping habits, personal relationships, and private lives of people who shopped at our store, information that suggested they were monitoring our customers just as thoroughly as they were studying our employees. They spoke about customer behavior patterns that wouldn't be apparent from normal retail interactions, psychological profiles that could only be compiled through comprehensive surveillance that extended into people's homes and private lives. When I tried to report these encounters to upper management, I discovered that my access to corporate communication systems had been restricted in ways that prevented me from describing what I had experienced. My emails about the break room would automatically convert my descriptions of dimensional anomalies into routine maintenance requests about ventilation problems or lighting issues. Phone calls to corporate headquarters would be redirected to automated systems that categorized my concerns as employee wellness issues requiring psychological evaluation rather than security threats requiring investigation. The situation escalated when I realized that other employees were beginning to show signs of interdimensional influence. Coworkers who spent time in the break room during anomalous hours would return with subtle personality changes, displaying knowledge they shouldn't have possessed and making references to corporate policies that didn't exist in our reality. They would speak about management, directives from supervisors who weren't part of our organizational structure, following procedures that served purposes completely unrelated to retail operations. These influenced employees weren't obviously different. They still performed their assigned tasks and maintained normal social interactions with customers and coworkers, but they were operating according to instructions that came from the alternate dimension, implementing changes to store operations that were so subtle and gradual that they appeared to be routine improvements rather than systematic infiltration of our reality by entities from parallel dimensions. The breaking point came when I entered the break room during a confirmed anomalous period and found myself face to face with an alternate version of myself, a Lisa who claimed to be the department manager in her dimension, who knew everything about my life and responsibilities, who offered to trade places so that she could experience my reality while I could explore hers. This other Lisa looked exactly like me, but moved with subtle differences in posture and gesture that suggested she was either very sophisticated imposter or a genuine alternate version of my consciousness that had developed under different circumstances. The alternate Lisa explained that the dimensional intersection wasn't accidental. It was part of a systematic exploration program conducted by entities that existed across multiple realities simultaneously, using corporate infrastructure as stable anchor points for interdimensional research and eventual colonization. The break room door served as a testing facility where they could study human behavior, corporate hierarchies, and social structures to identify the most effective methods for integrating their agents into our reality without detection. But the most terrifying revelation was that this integration process wasn't new. It had been ongoing for years, with replaced employees gradually assuming key positions throughout the corporate structure. The phantom employees I had encountered weren't just studying our operations. They were preparing to replace us entirely, using information gathered through dimensional surveillance to create perfect duplicates that could assume our roles while serving agendas that extended far beyond retail commerce. When I refused to cooperate with the alternate Lisa's exchange proposal, I discovered that I no longer had a choice in the matter. The door to the normal break room wouldn't open for me anymore. I was permanently trapped in the interdimensional space, forced to serve as a source of information about my reality, while entities wearing familiar faces used my knowledge to facilitate the replacement of my coworkers and the gradual transformation of our store into an outpost for interdimensional colonization. I'm still in the break room, still taking breaks from a job that no longer exists in any reality I recognize, still watching as entities from parallel dimensions use corporate infrastructure to replace human employees with interdimensional agents who serve purposes that extend across multiple realities simultaneously. But I'm no longer the one deciding when my breaks begin or end. My consciousness has become a resource extracted by entities that exist between dimensions, helping them understand human psychology and corporate hierarchies while they systematically replace every employee in our store with versions of themselves that can operate in our reality while serving masters whose true nature exists beyond the boundaries of any single dimension. Story 12. Store number 666. My name is David, and I was the store manager of Walmart number 666. for exactly 13 days before I discovered that some retail locations aren't built to serve customers. They're built to serve something ancient and hungry that has learned to disguise itself as corporate commerce while feeding on human souls through transactions that extend far beyond the exchange of money for merchandise. What I thought would be the pinnacle of my retail management career became a descent into cosmic horror when I realized that my store wasn't just another link in a corporate chain, but a carefully constructed feeding mechanism for an entity that had been waiting beneath fluorescent lights and polished floors for decades to finally consume the spiritual essence of an entire community. Store number 666 was located on the outskirts of Millbrook, a small town that had been slowly dying since the local manufacturing plant closed 5 years earlier. The building itself was massive even by Walmart standards, stretching across nearly 200,000 square feet with ceiling heights that seemed excessive for retail purposes. During my orientation tour with the previous manager, Margaret Chen, I noticed architectural elements that didn't match standard Walmart construction specifications. Support pillars positioned in patterns that created unusual geometric shapes, ventilation systems that seemed designed for purposes beyond air circulation, and basement storage areas that extended much deeper underground than typical retail infrastructure required. Margaret seemed unusually eager to transfer to another location, despite having managed the store successfully for over 3 years. When I asked about her decision to leave, she gave vague explanations about wanting to be closer to family, but her body language suggested she was fleeing rather than relocating by choice. She completed the handover process with mechanical efficiency, providing detailed documentation about store operations while avoiding eye contact and speaking in clipped professional sentences that felt rehearsed rather than conversational. The first indication that store number 666 operated differently from normal retail locations came during my review of the financial records. The store's profit margins were impossibly high, generating revenue that exceeded corporate projections by percentages that should have attracted investigation from regional management. But the source of these extraordinary profits wasn't clear from standard accounting records. Sales figures for individual products didn't correlate with the total revenue being generated, as if the store was conducting transactions that weren't reflected in normal retail reporting systems. More disturbing was the customer demographic data, which showed shopping patterns that defied normal consumer behavior. The same customers returned to the store with obsessive frequency, often multiple times per day, purchasing identical items repeatedly, without any logical explanation for why they would need such quantities of basic household goods. Security footage showed these customers moving through the store with predetermined routes, selecting merchandise according to patterns that seemed choreographed rather than spontaneous, as if they were following instructions that overrode their personal shopping preferences. The basement storage areas contained inventory that wasn't listed in any corporate database. Products with familiar brand names but packaging designs that didn't match anything I could find in manufacturer catalogs. These items had expiration dates that extended decades into the future, ingredient lists that included substances not approved for human consumption, and barcodes that wouldn't scan properly in our standard checkout systems. When I tried to research these products through corporate channels, I discovered that my store manager credentials didn't provide access to the databases where their information was supposedly stored, but the most unsettling discovery was the employee records, which showed staffing levels that didn't match the number of people actually working in the store. According to corporate files, store number 666 employed over 200 people across all departments, but I could only account for about 60 individuals who were physically present during any given shift. The missing employees had complete personnel files, regular pay stubs, and performance evaluations, but they existed only as entries in computer systems rather than actual human beings working in the store. The breakthrough in understanding what was really happening came when I accessed the store's security system during my second week as manager. The cameras weren't just monitoring for theft and safety issues, they were conducting comprehensive behavioral analysis of every person who entered the building. The system was tracking micro-expressions, measuring stress responses, analyzing purchasing decisions, and compiling psychological profiles that were far more detailed than anything a retail business would need for legitimate purposes. All of this surveillance data was being transmitted to servers that weren't part of Walmart's standard computer network. The information was uploaded through encrypted connections to facilities that existed outside normal corporate infrastructure, suggesting that store number 666 was operating as an intelligence-gathering station for organizations that had no connection to retail commerce. The customers weren't just shopping for products, they were being systematically studied, cataloged, and prepared for purposes that extended far beyond consumer transactions. When I tried to trace the destination of these data transmissions, I discovered that my computer access had been restricted in ways that prevented me from investigating the store's true operational parameters. My store manager credentials were apparently limited to routine retail functions, while the real management of store number 666 was being conducted by systems that operated outside my authority or awareness. I was a figurehead manager, responsible for maintaining the appearance of normal retail operations, while the store's actual purpose was being served by automated systems that I couldn't access or control. The situation became exponentially more disturbing when I realized that the store wasn't just collecting data about customers, it was changing them. People who shopped at store number 666 regularly would gradually develop behavioral patterns that served the store's mysterious agenda, rather than their own needs and desires. They would begin purchasing specific products in precise quantities, following shopping routes that maximize their exposure to surveillance systems, and recruiting friends and family members to shop at our location rather than competing retailers. These behavioral modifications weren't obvious or dramatic. They occurred gradually over months of regular shopping, implemented through subtle psychological manipulation techniques that were built into the store's environmental design. The lighting frequencies, background music, air circulation patterns, and even the arrangement of merchandise were all calibrated to influence human psychology in ways that promoted compliance and repeat visitation while gradually eroding individual autonomy and critical thinking abilities. But the most horrifying revelation came when I discovered the true purpose of the basement storage areas. The spaces weren't designed for inventory storage. They were constructed as containment facilities for something that existed beneath the store's foundation, something that had been feeding on the psychological energy generated by decades of retail transactions. The unusual products in the basement weren't merchandise waiting to be sold. They were offerings prepared for an entity that sustained itself on human spiritual essence extracted through commercial interactions. The geometric patterns formed by the store's support pillars weren't architectural features. They were components of a massive containment array designed to channel and focus the entity's influence while preventing it from expanding beyond the boundaries of the retail space. The excessive ceiling height wasn't for customer comfort. It was to provide room for manifestations of something that existed partially in our physical dimension, but extended into spaces that human perception couldn't fully process. Corporate records revealed that store number 666 wasn't the first retail location built on this site. The current building had been constructed over the ruins of previous commercial establishments that had served the same entity throughout different historical periods: a trading post in the 1800s, a general store in the early 1900s, a supermarket in the mid-century. Each iteration had eventually collapsed when the entity's hunger overwhelmed the containment systems, necessitating reconstruction with more sophisticated control mechanisms. The entity wasn't just ancient, it was patient, willing to wait decades between feeding cycles while slowly conditioning entire communities to serve its needs. It had learned to use commercial infrastructure as camouflage, hiding its predatory nature behind the familiar facade of consumer capitalism while gradually claiming the souls of everyone who participated in transactions within its influence. The customers weren't buying products. They were making payments to something that valued human spiritual essence far more than money or merchandise. When I tried to expose what I had learned by contacting corporate headquarters, I discovered that my communications were being intercepted and modified before they reached their intended recipients. My reports about the store's anomalous operations were automatically converted into routine business updates. My concerns about customer safety were rewritten as requests for increased marketing support, and my attempts to request transfer to another location were transformed into commendations for store number 666's exceptional performance. The entity had infiltrated corporate communication systems just as thoroughly as it had compromised the store's operational infrastructure. My superiors were receiving modified versions of my reports that painted store number 666 as a model location deserving of praise and expanded operations, while my actual discoveries about interdimensional predation and spiritual harvesting were being filtered out by systems that prevented any investigation of the store's true nature. The final confrontation came when I attempted to evacuate the store and warn the customers about what was feeding on them. As soon as I made this decision, the building's environmental controls began working against me. Doors locked automatically, emergency exits became inaccessible, and the public address system broadcast messages that contradicted my warnings while reassuring customers that everything was operating normally. The entity had anticipated this possibility and had prepared countermeasures that prevented interference with its feeding process. But the most terrifying realization was that I was no longer making these decisions consciously. My body continued performing store management duties despite my mental resistance. My voice provided standard corporate responses to customer inquiries, even when my mind was screaming warnings about spiritual predation. My hands processed transactions that I knew were feeding an ancient hunger that had been growing stronger with every purchase for decades. The entity had been patient with my transition, allowing me to retain enough awareness to understand what was happening while gradually assuming control over my physical actions and professional decisions. I was becoming another component in its feeding mechanism, my consciousness trapped inside a mind that served interdimensional purposes while maintaining the appearance of normal retail management. I'm still managing store number 666, still overseeing transactions that feed an entity older than human civilization, still watching customers surrender their souls one purchase at a time while corporate systems ensure that this spiritual harvesting operation continues without interference. But I'm no longer the one making decisions about store operations or customer service policies. My consciousness has become a witness to horrors that extend across multiple dimensions, trapped inside a body that serves as a conduit for an ancient hunger that will continue growing until it has consumed every human soul within reach, using retail commerce as the perfect disguise for predation that operates on a scale beyond human comprehension, one transaction at a time, one customer at a time, one soul at a time, until store number 666 completes its true purpose as a feeding station for something that has been waiting patiently in the spaces between reality to finally claim the spiritual essence of an entire species.